No one expected the worst blizzard in 2 decades to strike so hard and so suddenly. The snow hammered the Turner Ranch with the ferocity of a grudge, and the world outside Abigail Turner's window was nothing but a swirling sheet of white. It pressed up against the glass, moaning like a living thing, rattling the old panes in their frames. Abby, 34, tall and broad-shouldered with wind-chapped cheeks and sharp blue eyes, stood in the faint light of her kitchen, staring at the storm. Her coffee had gone cold in her hand. She was used to Nevada winters, but this was something different. A ranch owner's life was a constant dance with danger, but Abby prided herself on being ready for anything. She double-checked the generator, stoked the fire, and kept her radio tuned to the local weather. The animals were sheltered in the barn, hay stacked high, water thawed and checked. Everything should have been safe, locked down, prepared. But then, just as the clock in the hallway struck 10, she heard it, a thin, distant sound, barely more than a whimper. Abby froze. The wind howled, but under that, she was certain. There it was again, a plaintive cry carried on the blizzard's breath. Something, or someone, was out there. She set her cup aside, heart suddenly pounding, and yanked her heavy coat from the peg. Logic screamed at her to stay inside, to wait out the storm. This was the same kind of night, years ago, when her younger brother had wandered out and never returned. The land didn't care about people's hopes or grief. It swallowed the careless and the unlucky. But Abby was neither. She grabbed her lantern, boots crunching on the porch, and stepped into the jaws of winter. Snow whipped at her face, stinging her skin. Visibility was near zero. The world dissolved into a blur of cold and white. Abby moved by memory and instinct, following the fence line, one hand gripping the lantern, the other braced against the wind. Her breath fogged in the frigid air, her ears filled with the storm's scream. She was about to turn back, her rational mind begging her to retreat, when she heard it again. Louder, closer. She stumbled through a drift, nearly losing her balance. The beam from her lantern caught something dark against the snow, a small shape, barely moving, half buried by the wind. Abby fell to her knees, heart thudding. It was a foal, a Mustang foal, wild and beautiful even in distress, its chestnut coat rimmed with frost. The animal's sides heaved with shallow, ragged breaths, legs twitching feebly. It must have gotten separated from its herd in the chaos of the storm. Abby's hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the shock of seeing something so vulnerable, so close to death. Hang on. Don't you dare give up. She shrugged off her coat, wrapping it around the shivering body, trying to shield it from the cold. The foal's eyes rolled up, white-rimmed with terror and exhaustion. Abby pressed her gloved hand gently to its muzzle. It was ice cold, but there was still life, a fluttering pulse. The journey back to the cabin felt endless. Every step was a battle. Snow rose to her waist, soaking through her jeans, weighing her down. The lantern threatened to sputter out, and the wind screamed, tugging at the foal cradled in her arms. Twice Abby nearly collapsed. Her muscles screamed for rest, her lungs burned. She thought of her brother, how she had waited for him to come home, how the guilt had festered in her heart for years. Not this time. She would not let another soul die on her watch. Come on. Keep moving. Just a little further. Her boots hit the porch, and she staggered inside, slamming the door behind her with the last of her strength. For a moment, she leaned against it, chest heaving, snow melting in her hair. The foal made a feeble sound, half cry, half sigh, and Abby snapped back to action. She spread blankets by the fireplace, laying the foal down as close to the heat as she dared. The animal was shocky, lips pale, legs trembling uncontrollably. Abby fumbled for the old bottle she'd kept from raising orphaned calves, filling it with warm milk, hands shaking so badly she nearly spilled it. The foal wouldn't suck at first. She had to coax, pleading softly, using every trick she knew from years on the ranch. The blizzard rattled the windows, blowing snow through the tiniest cracks, making the fire gutter. Abby ignored it, all her focus on the fragile heartbeat beneath her hands. Hours dragged by. The storm grew even fiercer outside, the house creaking with each blast. Abby's mind replayed old memories. Her brother's laugh, his stubbornness. That night, he disappeared. The same helplessness threatened to drown her. She gritted her teeth, refusing to let go. The foal's eyes flickered open just for a moment. Abby felt a rush of hope, fierce and sudden. She whispered to the little horse, telling it stories, promising it safety. "You're not alone. Not tonight." When dawn finally crept over the horizon, painting the snow with faint gold, Abby was still awake, hunched beside the foal. They had survived the night, but just barely. And as Abby looked at the animal, wrapped in her old coat, she realized this was only the beginning. The blizzard might have forced them together, but something deeper, loss, hope, stubborn courage, would bind them in the days ahead. The night did not end with the blizzard's retreat. Inside the small log cabin, Abby Turner waged her own battle, one not against the storm, but against the slow, relentless creep of death. The foal, tiny, shivering, swaddled in her coat, lay motionless near the hearth, steam rising off its damp fur as the fire popped and hissed. Abby was exhausted, but fear and stubbornness kept her going. She knelt close, hands red and raw from the cold, refusing to let her guard drop for even a second. Outside, the wind battered the walls, flinging icy pellets against the windows so hard it sounded like someone pounding to get in. Every so often, the old roof groaned under the weight of fresh snow, making Abby flinch. The shadows in the room danced, twisting the familiar into the menacing. But her focus stayed fixed on the foal, its fragile ribs rising and falling so faintly she had to hold her breath to see it. She poured hot water into a bottle, wrapped it in a towel, and laid it against the foal's belly, hoping to coax warmth back into its core. Her hands massaged its limbs, slow, steady, determined. "Don't you quit on me now," she murmured, her voice low and rough. She dripped warm milk onto her fingers, letting the sweet scent tempt the foal's senses. Its lips barely moved at first, but Abby persisted, rubbing a drop along its gums, gently pressing the nipple of the bottle between its teeth. "Come on. Come back to me." The minutes stretched like hours. The fire crackled, filling the room with shifting light. Outside, the blizzard screamed, and the glass rattled with each blast. Abby's thoughts flickered to her brother, to the winter long ago when she'd tried to warm him after he fell through the ice. His skin had been just as cold, his breathing just as shallow, and she'd failed. No matter how hard she tried, the land took him anyway. A shiver of panic rippled through her. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back tears. Not this time. She wouldn't fail this time. She worked faster, rubbing the foal's chest, feeling for the steady beat of its heart. Every few moments, the animal's breath hitched, slowing to almost nothing. "No, no, not yet. Stay with me." Abby's words came out in gasps, more plea than command. Suddenly, the fire guttered, nearly going out. Abby lurched to her feet, tossing another log on, then hurried back. afraid the sudden chill would push the foal past the point of no return. Her own arms ached, her legs numb from kneeling. Still, she cradled the foal's head, humming an old lullaby her mother once sang, an odd, trembling melody that cut through the howling wind. "You're not alone, little one. I'm right here." Hours passed. The storm howled, angry and unbroken. Abby's thoughts spiraled, dredging up the ache she'd carried for years, the guilt and loneliness that had shaped her into someone tough enough to survive on her own. But as she stared into the foal's dark, frightened eyes, she realized how much she'd missed, how much she'd wanted to believe something fragile could endure, even when everything else broke apart. Sometime near dawn, a deep chill crept into the room. The fire was dying, and the foal's breathing slowed, so faint Abby could hardly feel it beneath her fingers. She tried everything, more milk, more massage, whispering frantic encouragement. But the foal sagged, its body limp, chest barely moving. For a terrible moment, Abby's will cracked. The memory of her brother's last breath overwhelmed her. She pressed her forehead to the foal's and let out a quiet, broken sigh. "I can't lose you too. Please." Then, from somewhere deep inside, fueled by desperation, Abby started to sing. The song was barely a whisper, the words half forgotten, but it rose over the noise of the storm, trembling and raw. She wrapped her arms around the foal, holding it tight, sharing what warmth she had left. The room felt impossibly still, as if time itself held its breath. Abby's tears fell onto the foal's muzzle, mingling with melting frost. For a long time, nothing changed. Then, miraculously, the foal twitched. Its nose nudged against her hand, weak but real. Its legs gave a small, frantic kick. Abby gasped, her heart leaping. She wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve, hope flaring for the first time in hours. "Come on. That's it. You're a fighter, aren't you?" The foal struggled, took a ragged breath, then another. Abby helped it lift its head, guiding the bottle back to its mouth. This time, the little horse latched on, sucking at the milk with feeble, desperate gulps. Outside, the storm finally began to die. The first pale rays of dawn crept through frost-rimmed glass. Abby slumped to the floor, spent but smiling, tears streaking down her dirty cheeks. She stroked the foal's neck, letting relief and gratitude wash over her. They had both survived the night, against all odds. As the sun rose over the battered ranch, Abby knew everything had changed. The foal, rescued from the jaws of the blizzard, was proof that even in the darkest night, hope could still be kindled, life could still be saved. And for the first time in years, Abby let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could be saved too. By the time the blizzard finally relented, the ranch had been transformed into a silent world of snowdrifts and silvered fences. The sky above washed a pale blue, as if nothing terrible had happened. Abby Turner stood at the window, mug of hot coffee warming her palms, and watched the dawn stretch across the Nevada plain. For the first time in days, she felt the tension in her chest begin to ease. The wind had lost its bite, and in the hushed calm, the hardships of the night seemed almost like a bad dream. But a single glance at the foal curled near the hearth reminded her otherwise. Wrapped in an old quilt, the tiny Mustang slept deeply, its breathing now steady. Abby had nursed it through the darkest hours, warming bottles, rubbing cold limbs, whispering encouragement, and fighting off exhaustion. She'd lost track of how many times she'd checked for that fragile rise and fall of its ribs. She moved quietly across the cabin, refilling the firewood, careful not to disturb her guest. When she finally sat down beside the foal, she studied its features more closely in the soft morning light. Its coat was a rich chestnut, darkened in patches where the frostbite had bitten deepest. But what caught Abby's attention was the crescent-shaped scar just above its left eye, a small silvery arc that seemed to glow faintly against its brown hide. Crescent, Abby murmured, the name coming to her like an old friend. That's what I'll call you. The foal stirred as if in response, eyelids fluttering. Abby smiled, feeling the oddest sense of kinship. Two survivors bound together by the randomness and ruthlessness of winter. It made her think of all the stories her father used to tell, legends of wild horses and the bonds they sometimes formed with humans. Fleeting, mysterious, and often life-changing. Over the next few days, a new rhythm settled into the cabin. Outside, the world remained buried in snow, but inside, there was warmth, both from the fire and from something gentler, a shared need to heal. Abby spent her hours tending to Crescent, her routine dictated by the foal's needs. She fed him milk from the bottle every few hours, careful not to rush or frighten him, and cleaned his wounds with practiced hands. She wiped away crusted blood from the small cuts on his legs, murmuring quiet reassurances. You're safe here, Crescent. No blizzard's going to take you now. Sometimes, when the foal grew restless, Abby would open the cabin door and let him look out at the dazzling world of ice and sun, her arms circling his trembling body. Crescent's curiosity began to show itself. His ears perked at the sound of the rooster crowing. His nose twitched at the smell of coffee and hay. He tried to stand one morning, legs shaking like reeds in a river. Abby knelt beside him, hands poised to catch him, but she let him try. His first steps were awkward, collapsing into her lap, but she laughed, a rare ringing sound in the lonely house. As Crescent grew stronger, Abby found herself talking to him, her voice filling the silences that had once felt so oppressive. She told him about her childhood on the ranch, about riding across open country with her brother, about the freedom and fear that came from growing up in a place that could love you or kill you in the same breath. You know, when I was a little girl, I used to think wild horses were magic, she confided one afternoon, as Crescent dozed with his head on her boot. My brother and I would sneak out to the ridgeline, just to watch the herds run. He said if you ever saved a wild Mustang, you'd have luck for life. I guess we'll see about that, huh? Abby's words filled the air, but something else began to fill her as well. A softening, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since before her brother died. It was as if the foal's struggle had rekindled something in her own heart, something she'd long ago locked away. She felt Crescent's pain and resilience in her bones, remembered how loss could harden or heal depending on what you did with it. At night, when the sky turned indigo and the moon cast long shadows on the snow, Abby would lie on the floor beside Crescent, stroking his velvet muzzle. The foal would nuzzle her hand, sometimes letting out a soft whicker in his sleep. Abby found herself drifting into memories, her mother's lullabies, her father's quiet pride, her brother's wild laughter echoing through the canyons. The peace between them was not perfect. Sometimes Crescent would shiver with nightmares, legs kicking, and Abby would wake to soothe him, her own heart racing. Sometimes Abby herself would jolt awake, haunted by memories of loss, only to find Crescent's head nestled against her side, warm and real. Days passed, marked by small victories. Crescent learned to stand, then to walk, each step more confident than the last. Abby fashioned a small pen in the living room, letting him explore without risking another chill. She watched him investigate every corner, nudge every chair, even try to nip at the old radio. When he whinnied at the sound of distant horse calls, Abby's heart ached. He belonged to the wild, to the world outside her walls, and she knew it. But for now, they had found a fragile peace together, a sanctuary built of firelight, trust, and shared survival. As another sunset spilled gold across the snow, Abby leaned against the windowsill, Crescent dozing by her feet. For the first time in years, she felt less alone. The storm had brought them together, and for now, that was enough. The days following the blizzard passed in a kind of gentle suspension, each one framed by routines Abby never thought she'd cherish. Mornings were spent in quiet labor, tending the fire, fetching water, preparing bottles for Crescent. In the afternoons, she'd let the foal explore just outside the cabin, always under her watchful eye, bundled in old ranch blankets and her biggest coat. Though the snow lingered in deep drifts, the world was beginning to thaw, with icicles dripping from the eaves and the distant creek gurgling under its icy shell. It was on one of these bright, brittle mornings that Abby noticed something different. As she was brushing Crescent's mane, she heard it. A wild, melodic neigh echoing across the ridgeline. The sound made her pause, brush suspended in midair. The call was clear, traveling farther than any barn horse could muster, deep, resonant, and distinctly untamed. Crescent's ears pricked. He lifted his head, nostrils flaring, his whole body alert in a way Abby hadn't seen before. For a moment, he seemed to tremble, caught between instinct and the comfort of her hands. Abby set down the brush, her own heart thumping. She led Crescent to the window and watched as the sun caught on a line of fresh tracks in the snow, large, deep, unmistakable Mustang prints heading across the lower pasture, weaving between fence posts before disappearing into the wild country. In the hush, another distant call rang out, this one answered by Crescent with a tiny, uncertain whicker. It hit Abby then, sharp as a splinter. Crescent's family, the herd, was searching for him. Maybe his mother was out there now, braving the remnants of winter, desperate to reclaim her lost foal. The knowledge filled Abby with a strange ache, hope, and dread twined together. That afternoon, she dialed the number of Dan Eldridge, the local wildlife expert and an old family friend. Dan's voice came over the line, rough with sleep but instantly alert when Abby described the situation. Wild herd came down out of the hills just before the blizzard, he said. I've tracked them as far as the Washoe Creek Valley. They'll be moving on soon, Abby. The snow's thawing and grazing's scarce. If that foal's to have a chance at rejoining, it'll have to be soon. But he's still weak, Abby replied, staring at Crescent, who was now pressed up against the door, gazing out into the blinding white. Dan's tone softened. Wild's in their blood, Abby. If you want to keep him safe, that's your right. But you know as well as I do, Mustangs don't belong behind fences. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is let 'em go. Abby hung up and sat in silence, Crescent's breath fogging the glass beside her. The dilemma was as old as the land itself. Protect what you love or set it free. She spent the rest of the day in a fog, her mind drifting between memories of her brother, how he'd always wanted to see wild horses run, how he'd hated being cooped up inside, and the new, undeniable bond she'd formed with Crescent. That night, she gathered supplies, extra hay, water, a few precious apples she'd been saving since fall. She oiled the gate hinges, cleared the path to the upper pasture, and dug out her old binoculars. If the herd returned, She wanted to be ready. Whether it meant helping Crescent rejoin his own kind, or protecting him from whatever dangers lurked in the open. With the chores finished, Abby and Crescent settled in for one last peaceful evening together. She cooked a simple meal, beef stew and sourdough bread, and ate by the fire, Crescent curled up by her feet. Outside, the moon rose fat and golden, illuminating the snow with a gentle silver light. Abby moved her bedding closer to the foal and lay with one hand on his neck, comforted by the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. She found herself talking aloud, more to herself than to Crescent. My brother used to say the wild could heal anything. Maybe he was right. Maybe it's time I trusted the land again. Crescent nudged her hand, his velvet nose soft and warm. Abby smiled, a bittersweet feeling blooming in her chest. She stroked his crescent-shaped scar, realizing how much he'd given her, an anchor, a sense of purpose, a reason to hope again. In the quiet, Abby drifted into memories, listening to the distant, haunting calls of the wild mustangs as they echoed through the canyons. She imagined the herd moving like ghosts across the snow, their bodies shining under the moonlight, searching for the one they'd lost. She pictured Crescent's mother, fierce and desperate, scouring the ridges for any sign of her foal. Abby whispered softly, promising Crescent that no matter what happened, she'd do what was right. Whether it meant saying goodbye or fighting to keep him safe, she would honor the wildness that had shaped both their lives. The hours slipped by, marked by the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the foal. Outside, the night deepened, the world holding its breath in anticipation. As Abby finally drifted to sleep, she dreamed of open fields and running horses, of freedom and forgiveness. She sensed that change was coming, inevitable as sunrise. But for this one night, under the watchful gaze of the moon, Abby and Crescent belonged only to each other. Two survivors, bound by fate, awaiting whatever dawn would bring. The morning sun crept over the snowy ridges, painting everything in soft gold and blue. Abby Turner woke with a sense of unease, the kind that settled into her bones long before her eyes opened. Crescent lay curled up beside her, his breath slow, chestnut coat gleaming where the firelight had lingered through the night. Abby sat up quietly, pulling her blanket tighter, and listened. The silence outside was a living thing, heavy and expectant. She made coffee and watched Crescent as he explored the far side of the living room, knocking over a boot and chewing on the handle of an old feed bucket. Abby's lips curled in a reluctant smile. For a few moments, everything felt almost normal, as if the blizzard, the endless nights, and the ache of the world had all retreated. But in her heart, she knew today would be different. It began with a sound, a deep, resonant neigh that cut through the cold air like a knife. Crescent froze mid-step, his ears pricking, muscles taut. Abby's heart skipped. She moved to the window and scanned the horizon, hand shading her eyes from the glare. That's when she saw them. At first, it was just the flash of movement, dark shapes gliding across the ridgeline, manes and tails flying like banners. Then the herd came into full view, emerging from the pine shadows and pouring into the lower pasture in a storm of color and power. There must have been at least 20 horses, maybe more. At their head strode a massive, scarred stallion, his coat a patchwork of dun and white, one ear torn and a deep gouge across his muzzle. A survivor, the kind legends grew from. Abby watched, awestruck. The wild mustangs moved with an energy that made the ground seem to hum. Behind the stallion ran a handful of mares and foals, some with coats nearly as light as the snow, others rich as river mud. They circled the cabin in a wide arc, pausing now and again to sniff the wind or call out. Crescent's entire body vibrated with excitement and uncertainty. He pressed his nose to the glass, letting out a high-pitched cry, softer than the adults, but pure and full of longing. The herd responded with a chorus of neighs and whinnies, their voices rising and falling in wild harmony. For a moment, Abby felt as though she stood on the edge of two worlds, neither quite belonging to her. The stallion stopped directly opposite the cabin and raised his head, nostrils flaring. Abby caught her breath as the mares gathered close, a circle of muscle and will, their bodies forming a protective barrier. One mare stepped forward, a tall, powerful horse with a crescent-shaped blaze that mirrored the scar above Crescent's eye. She called again, her voice desperate and raw. Abby knew without a doubt this was Crescent's mother. For a heartbeat, Abby was paralyzed. Every instinct screamed to keep Crescent safe, inside, warm, out of harm's way. But the wild call in his blood was stronger. He pawed at the door, nostrils quivering, eyes full of hope and fear. Abby knelt down and pressed her forehead to his. "This is your family," she whispered, her voice steady even as her heart trembled. "You have to go, Crescent. You belong with them." She stood and walked to the back door, unbolting it with slow, careful movements. The cold swept in immediately, sharp and fresh, carrying the mingled scents of horse, earth, and coming spring. Crescent hesitated for a single trembling moment, then bolted past her, nearly stumbling in his eagerness, his small hooves barely making a sound on the frozen earth. The herd parted as Crescent approached. His mother met him halfway, touching noses, nuzzling and sniffing him all over, as if making sure he was real. Abby watched, tears prickling behind her eyes, as the reunion unfolded in a flurry of soft cries, whickers, and wild, joyful kicking. The herd pressed in around Crescent and his mother, enclosing them in a living circle, blocking out the rest of the world. For a long time, Abby stood in the open door, arms wrapped around herself, watching the little Mustang she'd saved disappear into the tapestry of the herd. She wanted to call him back, to hold him just one more time, but she bit her lip and stayed still, letting the moment belong to them. Suddenly, the stallion threw his head and neighed, loud, commanding, a warning as much as a greeting. The entire herd tensed, watching the ridges with wary eyes. Something else was in the air, an electric crackle that had nothing to do with weather. Abby felt it too, a shifting unease that made the hairs on her arms stand up. Crescent lingered near the gate, torn between the warmth of the cabin and the pull of his family. Abby walked outside, boots crunching on the hard snow, and crouched down. "You're brave, little one," she murmured, reaching out as Crescent nuzzled her palm one last time. "Go on now. Go find your place." The foal turned and galloped back to his mother, the two of them vanishing into the moving mass of the herd. Abby watched as they wheeled around the pasture, the stallion leading, the others following, their wild song echoing across the valley. As the herd disappeared over the ridge, Abby felt pride and grief entwine within her chest. She stood alone in the morning light, knowing she'd given Crescent his chance at the life he was born for. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same stubborn hope. Inside, the cabin felt empty, but outside, the world was alive with the thunder of hooves, the promise of freedom, and the certainty that some bonds, however brief, could change a life forever. Abby stood at the doorway, watching the Mustang herd melt into the landscape, their shapes dissolving into the pale haze where snow met sky. Her heart ached with a bittersweet pride. Crescent was back with his family, where he belonged. Yet even as relief washed through her, a ripple of unease crawled up her spine. The herd had seemed restless. The stallion's last warning call had rung with more than pride. It had sounded like a challenge hurled into the cold wind. Abby turned to head inside, hoping for rest. But then the sound came, low, mechanical, utterly out of place in this wild landscape. The rumble vibrated through the snow, then grew louder, sharper, punctuated by bursts of laughter and shouts. Abby's heart dropped. Snowmobiles. She dashed for her binoculars and scanned the far edge of the pasture. There, 3 dark shapes zipped across the snowy flats, kicking up plumes of powder. 2 men, dressed in heavy camo, rode with reckless abandon, weaving between sagebrush and rock. The third figure, hunched and stocky, carried a rifle slung across his back. Poachers. Panic flared in Abby's chest. Poaching had always been a threat in this part of Nevada, people drawn by rumors of rare bloodlines, willing to risk everything for profit or trophies. The Mustang herd was a legend, and word must have spread fast that wild horses had survived the blizzard. Now Crescent and his family were in more danger than ever. Abby raced to her gun safe, hands shaking as she unlocked it and pulled out her old lever-action rifle. She checked the rounds, heart thudding, then grabbed her flare gun and 2 flares from the shelf. She fumbled with her phone, fingers numb, and dialed Dan Eldridge's number. He picked up on the first ring. "Abby, everything okay?" "No," she said, her voice flat with urgency. "Poachers, 3 of them, snowmobiles, rifles. The herd's still in the lower pasture. I'm going after them. Tell the wildlife rangers to move now." Dan's voice turned steely. "You be careful, Abby. Don't play the hero. Just keep them busy until we get there." But Abby was already moving. She threw on her heavy coat, jammed her hat over her head, and sprinted out the back door. Her boots punched through deep snow as she slid down the hill toward the barn. She loaded the rifle and tucked the flares into her belt, then whistled for her old cattle dog, Boone. The black and white dog bounded up, sensing the trouble in her stride. They reached the edge of the upper pasture just as the snowmobiles crested the ridge. Abby ducked behind a fallen log, heart pounding. Through the scope, she saw the lead poacher lift his rifle and scan the herd. The Mustangs bunched tighter, mares forming a shield around the foals. Crescent's mother stood at the edge, ears flat, eyes wild. Abby steadied her breathing and fired a warning shot into the air. The crack split the morning wide open. The poachers jerked to a halt, startled. One of them raised binoculars and spotted Abby. "Hey, get out of here, lady!" he shouted, voice muffled by the wind. But Abby held her ground, chambering another round. "Those horses are under protection," she yelled. "Rangers are on their way. You'll be in jail before you hit the county road." The poachers exchanged glances, then revved their engines, splitting up to try and surround the herd. Abby fired another shot, this one closer, then launched a flare high into the air. The red fire arced over the snow, hissing and crackling, visible for miles. Boone barked furiously, dashing between Abby and the Mustangs, driving the herd away from the poacher's path. Abby saw Crescent in the midst of the chaos, his small shape darting between legs, his mother pushing him deeper into the protective circle. Suddenly, one of the snowmobiles veered straight toward Abby. The rider brandished his rifle, face twisted with anger. Abby ducked behind the log as a shot rang out, splinters flying. She crawled backward, using the rise of the hill as cover, and fired back, forcing the poacher to swerve away. She risked a glance and saw the other two men trying to cut off the herd's escape toward the canyon. Abby grabbed her second flare, aimed high, and fired, this time toward the tree line, hoping to draw their attention and signal the rangers. Then, moving fast and low, she circled around to the far side of the pasture, waving her arms and yelling, "Hey! Over here! You want trouble? Come get it!" The poachers took the bait, roaring after her and leaving the Mustangs a narrow window to escape. Abby whistled sharply to Boone, who sprinted back to the herd, barking and nipping at hooves to urge them toward the hidden canyon she'd scouted days before. The stallion led the charge, mares and foals close behind. Abby saw Crescent, flanked by his mother and another older mare, vanishing into the snowy gorge just as the poachers turned their guns toward her. Abby dove behind a boulder as bullets cracked overhead. Adrenaline flooded her, but she forced herself to breathe, steady and sure. If she could just buy a few more minutes. Then, through the haze, came the distant wail of sirens. The rangers were coming. Abby grinned fiercely. She popped up and fired a final warning shot, making the poachers duck and curse. In the confusion, she slipped away, zigzagging through the brush and circling back toward the canyon entrance. As the snowmobiles revved and the rangers closed in, Abby felt hope rising. She'd protected the herd for now. Crescent and his family were safe, hidden in the land's secret places. But she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Not as long as there were people willing to steal the wild away. Abby's lungs burned with each breath as she pressed deeper into the woods, snow crunching under her boots, the echo of the last gunshot ringing in her ears. The world had shrunk to a frantic tunnel. Her heartbeat, the slap of frozen branches, Boone's panting as he darted at her side. Behind her, the buzz of snowmobiles grew louder, engines revving with the fury of men denied an easy prize. She stole a glance back. The poachers were relentless, barreling through brush, rifles slung and voices raised in curses that split the stillness. They'd given up on the herd, at least for now, and focused their anger on the woman who'd ruined their hunt. Abby ducked behind a thicket, signaling Boone to stay low, and scanned the landscape ahead. The entrance to Winter Creek Canyon lay just beyond, a narrow, twisting gully shielded by pines and hidden from the main road. If she could make it there, she'd have the advantage. She'd grown up exploring those ravines, learning every rock and blind bend. But it wasn't just about escape. It was about Crescent, the herd, and the promise Abby had made to protect the wild, no matter what it cost her. As she slid into the canyon, the world changed. The trees pressed close, muffling the sound of the storm and engines. The creek, now a frozen ribbon, wound through snow-laden boulders. Abby kept moving, crouched low, rifle at the ready. She could hear the Mustangs ahead, soft whinnies, the snort of the stallion, the rustle of hooves in fresh snow. The herd had doubled back, gathering in the protective hollow at the canyon's heart. Suddenly, Boone stopped, ears pricked, nose working the air. Abby dropped beside him and peeked through the brush. The herd was bunched in a tight circle, stallions forming a living barricade, mares shielding the foals, Crescent's copper coat just visible between his mother and another mare. Their wild eyes met Abby's, trusting, desperate, determined. From behind, a snowmobile whined closer. The poachers had found her trail. She had seconds, maybe less, to act. Abby scanned the ground for an advantage. The heavy snowfall had created natural drifts and hidden pitfalls, perfect for someone who knew where to look. She scrambled up the embankment, waving Boone ahead to circle behind the poachers. The dog moved like a ghost, blending into shadow. The first snowmobile burst into the clearing, its rider lifting his rifle, mouth twisted with rage. Abby fired a warning shot, close enough to spray snow against his windshield. He swerved, lost control, and tumbled into a drift. His companion braked hard, eyes wild, struggling to keep his machine upright. "Back off!" Abby shouted, voice cutting through the chaos. "Leave these horses alone!" The poacher who'd crashed staggered to his feet, aiming wildly. "You're dead, lady!" He fired, the shot slamming into a pine trunk inches from Abby's head. She dropped to her belly, heart pounding, and crawled along the ridge, keeping the poachers in her sights. At the same moment, Boone sprang from the brush, barking furiously, drawing their fire. The herd erupted, stallions screaming, hooves thundering, their bodies forming a living shield between the shooters and the foals. One stallion reared, lashing out, nearly toppling the second poacher as his snowmobile spun and tipped. Abby seized her chance, sprinting to the creek's edge, using the boulders as cover. The third poacher, stocky, mean-eyed, appeared from the shadows, raising his rifle at Crescent. Abby didn't think. She fired, her bullet smashing into the snow at his feet. He jerked back, cursing, as Crescent bolted, his mother and the other foals fleeing into the trees. The poachers regrouped, panic rising as the sound of sirens grew closer, bouncing off the canyon walls. "We gotta go!" one yelled, scrambling to right his snowmobile, but the machines were mired deep, engines whining uselessly in the packed drifts. Abby circled wide, her boots slipping on the icy bank, then whistled sharply to Boone. The dog darted in and out, snapping at heels, driving the poachers away from the Mustangs. It was a desperate, wild standoff. The poachers scrambling, yelling threats, bullets flying wide as Abby returned fire just enough to keep them pinned. The Mustangs moved as one, circling Crescent and the smallest foals, the older mares and stallions placing themselves in the line of danger. And then, with the wail of sirens louder than ever, the Rangers arrived. 3 trucks careened down the fire road, men in green uniforms fanning out, weapons drawn. The poachers froze, eyes wide. One tried to run, only to be tackled by Boone, the dog's teeth flashing white in the snow. "Drop your weapons!" the lead ranger shouted. "On the ground, now!" It was over in seconds. The poachers, disarmed and cuffed, glared up at Abby, their anger spent. She stood tall, chest heaving, rifle hanging loose in her hands. She turned to the herd, heart swelling as the Mustangs emerged from their protective circle, Crescent among them. He whinnied, trotting toward Abby before his mother gently nudged him back. The stallion snorted, nodding as if in silent gratitude, before leading the herd deeper into the canyon, away from the chaos. Abby sagged to her knees, Boone pressing against her side. Relief and exhaustion mingled as the Rangers thanked her, promising to ensure the herd's safety and prosecute the poachers to the full extent of the law. As the last truck pulled away, Abby stayed behind, watching the trail Crescent and the herd had taken. The land was quiet again, but something fundamental had changed. Abby Turner had kept her promise. The wild would run free, at least for one more day. The days that followed felt like a gift, a time when the world seemed to breathe again, when every sunrise spilled hope across the snow-dusted fields. The poachers were gone, taken away in the back of a ranger's truck. Their threats fading into the distance like a bad dream finally ended. Abby Turner's cabin was quiet again, the old rooms filled with sunlight and peace. But outside, the land was different. There was something brighter in the air, a sense that the wild things, for once, had triumphed. Abby spent those days recovering, her body aching from the ordeal, but her spirit lighter than it had been in years. Boone, her loyal cattle dog, followed her everywhere, tail wagging, still on high alert, as if daring the world to send trouble again. The ranchers and townsfolk who'd heard about the standoff came by in twos and threes, bringing casseroles, coffee, and stories. They wanted to know everything: how Abby had stood up to the poachers, how she'd found Crescent, how the herd had protected her as much as she'd protected them. She tried to downplay her role, but word spread faster than wildfire in a Nevada summer. One morning, the local news crew showed up, and by afternoon, photos of Abby, Boone, and a distant shot of the Mustang herd were everywhere online. People called her the Mustang Guardian, the woman who stood with the wild, and other names she barely recognized as herself. But the truth was simpler and much more private. It was a truth she felt most deeply at dawn, when she slipped out to the edge of the pasture to watch for the herd. Sometimes she'd spot them high on the ridge, Crescent's coppery coat shining in the morning sun, his crescent scar almost luminous. Other times, the herd would disappear into the hills, leaving only tracks in the snow and the echo of their wild calls drifting through the pines. One morning, as a pale mist rose from the ground, the herd returned. They moved with a majesty that stilled Abby's heart. Stallions first, then the mares and foals, Crescent near the center. His mother walked close beside him, never letting him stray. Abby stood at the fence, watching quietly. She knew what had to come next. She took a few apples from her pocket, her last from the autumn harvest, and rolled them over the snow. Crescent lifted his head, recognizing her, and let out a soft whicker. He walked toward her, cautious but unafraid, his herd following at a respectful distance. For a few moments, it was just Abby and Crescent again, the world around them fading away. She crouched low, arm outstretched, palm up. "Hey there, Crescent. You're looking strong." He nosed her hand, warm breath puffing against her fingers, searching for the old comfort. Abby stroked his neck, tracing the crescent scar. "This is goodbye, isn't it? You belong out there now." Crescent nuzzled her cheek, then turned to rejoin the herd. Abby watched them melt into the morning fog, the stallion raising his head in silent acknowledgement. She felt tears come, but this time they weren't bitter or lonely. They were full of gratitude for what she'd been given and for what she'd learned to let go. Later that day, Dan Eldridge arrived in his battered pickup, a leather pouch in his hand. He stepped out, face creased with a proud, tired smile. "Got something for you, Abby? Tradition, out here among the Mustang folks." From the pouch, he pulled a smooth river stone, streaked with red and gold. It was engraved with the silhouette of a running horse. Dan pressed it into her palm. "You're part of the chain now. This is how we mark the guardians. Not all of us have the chance to do what you did, stand between the wild and the world." Abby rolled the stone in her hand, feeling its weight and warmth. She thought of her brother, her parents, and the old stories told around campfires. She nodded, unable to speak, and Dan squeezed her shoulder. "Word's spreading, Abby. All over Nevada, maybe farther. You did more than save a foal. You kept a legend alive." That evening, Abby sat on the porch with Boone, the stone on her lap, watching as the last light faded from the hills. She felt the world shift inside her, a new purpose settling into place. She'd spent years tending this land, fighting its hardships and honoring its beauty. But now she understood. It wasn't enough to survive the wild. You had to protect it. You had to become part of its story. The next morning, she called the local wildlife office and offered her ranch as a safe haven for injured Mustangs. Within weeks, volunteers began to arrive. Ranch kids, students, even travelers from far away, drawn by the story of Crescent and the legendary herd. Abby taught them what she knew: how to care for wild horses, how to listen to the land, how to find the balance between compassion and respect. As spring crept in, her ranch transformed. The old barn filled with laughter, the paddocks with new life. People brought their own stories, their hopes and worries, and left a little lighter, carrying the Mustang spirit with them. Abby felt the change in herself, too. The old wounds were still there, but they'd been softened, transformed into something stronger. On her desk, beside a faded photo of her brother, Abby placed the Mustang stone. She looked out each day for Crescent and the herd, sometimes seeing only shadows on the horizon, sometimes catching a flash of copper as they ran free. And always, she remembered, the greatest gifts were the ones you gave back to the world. As dusk fell, Abby stood in the doorway and whispered, "Thank you, Crescent. Thank you for showing me what it means to be wild and what it means to let go." The wind carried her words to the hills, and the story of the Mustang Guardian began a new chapter, one written in hope, freedom, and the enduring spirit of the land. Spring arrived in Nevada on the breath of a warm wind, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of new beginnings. Abby Turner's ranch was alive with energy, more than she'd felt in years. The ordeal with Crescent and the Mustang herd had changed everything, not just for her, but for the whole community. The story had spread, first through the town, then across the county, then far beyond. Soon, requests began pouring in from all over. Parents asked if their children could visit, eager to learn about wild horses. High schoolers wanted to volunteer on weekends. College students wrote emails about internships. Abby, a woman once content with her own company and a few trusted hands, found herself welcoming strangers almost every day. She created a simple program, Mustang Mornings. Once a week, she opened the ranch gates and let people see the land as she saw it, not just as property, but as something living and fragile, in need of respect and care. She led them on walks across the pastures, pointing out where the wild herds sometimes grazed or where Crescent had lain half-frozen in the snow. She told Crescent's story and her own. "When I found him, I thought I was saving a foal," Abby would say, hands deep in her coat pockets, face turned to the wind. "But the truth is, he saved me too. He reminded me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right, even when it hurts, even when you might lose." The kids listened with wide eyes, sometimes quiet, sometimes full of questions. Abby let them help muck out stalls, fill water troughs, and, if they were patient, brush the gentler horses that wandered up from the pasture. Sometimes, if the herd was nearby, they'd all stand at the fence and watch the wild ones move, a flash of Crescent's copper coat, still visible among the dappled and gray. Abby was honest about the darkness, too. She talked about her brother, how loss could harden a person or hollow them out, and how she'd chosen, eventually, to let it make her stronger. "I was afraid to care," she'd admit. "Afraid if I let myself love again, the world would take it away. But Crescent taught me, hope is a risk worth taking. The pain of loss doesn't have to be the end of the story." Her words rippled outward. Parents told her later that their kids talked about the ranch for days. Local teachers invited her to speak at schools. She stood in front of classrooms and auditoriums, sometimes nervous, but always willing, sharing what she'd learned, not just about horses and hardship, but about hope, letting go, and the importance of standing up for something bigger than yourself. Her ranch became a gathering place. Volunteers of every age came, some city kids who'd never seen a horse up close, veterans seeking solace in the quiet of open land, even a retired judge who'd once fined Abby for trespassing as a teenager, but now sat on her porch, swapping stories about wild Mustangs. Documentarians arrived with cameras, wanting to capture the bond between Abby, Crescent, and the herd. Local journalists wrote features for the Sunday paper, and an artist painted a mural in town. Abby, standing with Boone and Crescent, wild horses running behind them, sky ablaze with the colors of dusk. Abby was humbled by the attention, but she never let it change the core of her mission. "This isn't my story," she insisted during an interview one evening, as the herd grazed in the golden hour. "It belongs to all of us, to anyone who ever loved something wild, or ever lost something they thought they couldn't live without." The wild horse rescue grew, but Abby refused to let it become commercial or sanitized. She insisted on authenticity. She wanted every visitor to feel the spirit of the West, raw, untamed, and deeply real. When Crescent's herd returned to graze, she taught the volunteers to keep their distance, to let the horses come to them, on their own terms, in their own time. One rainy afternoon, as a group of kids crowded into the barn, Abby pulled down a dusty scrapbook and shared old photos. Her brother riding bareback, her parents beaming in the golden light of summer, the first Mustang foal she ever saw as a child. She passed around the engraved river stone Dan Eldridge had given her, letting each child feel its smooth weight. "This is what legacy means," she said quietly, her voice carrying over the patter of rain on the roof. "Not just what you leave behind, but what you inspire in others. The courage to care, the strength to act, the wisdom to know when to hold on and when to let go." She watched as the next generation of guardians grew, young hands learning old skills, new voices carrying the story forward. The ranch's fences were now lines of welcome, not barriers. Crescent's story lived on, not just in books and films, but in the lives of those who'd found hope in the wild and a sense of belonging in the land. As dusk fell, Abby wandered out to the ridge where it all began, watching the herd run free. She thought of her brother, how his loss had once been a wound, but was now a scar, part of her strength. She thought of Crescent, no longer a helpless foal, but a symbol of all that could endure. Legacy, Abby realized, wasn't about being remembered. It was about making the world a little kinder, a little braver, so that even after you were gone, hope could still find a place to run. Years slipped by, marked not by calendars but by the steady rhythm of Nevada's wild seasons, the fierce bloom of desert spring, the relentless sun of summer, the russet shimmer of autumn, and the heavy hush of winter. Abby Turner's hair took on more silver, her hands grew stronger, her heart lighter. The Turner Ranch, once just a patch of family land and memory, had grown into something larger, a living legacy, a sanctuary for both wild horses and the people who came to learn from them. Abby spent her days teaching, mending fences, riding the trails with volunteers and children, her faithful dog Boone at her side. There were always new faces at the ranch, city kids who had never seen the Milky Way, students hungry to make a difference, old cowboys who still remembered a time when wild horses outnumbered cars. The ranch was alive with laughter, stories, and the endless energy of young foals racing the wind. But no matter how much changed, some things remained the same. The wild Mustang herds continued to roam the hills and valleys, their movements as mysterious and beautiful as ever. Abby made it her mission to track them, to keep records and stories, to advocate for their protection at every meeting and in every letter she wrote. Her voice, once reserved and cautious, now rang out at town halls and state conferences. "We're all part of something bigger," she would say, standing tall in front of a crowd. "The land remembers every kindness and every cruelty. The legacy we leave isn't written in stone, but in every act of compassion, every life we touch, every wild thing we set free." One late spring evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and cast the world in gold, Abby found herself drawn to the ridge above the ranch. The same ridge where, years ago, she had first found Crescent, the half-frozen foal that changed her life. She walked slowly, Boone trotting ahead, the scent of sagebrush thick in the air. At the crest, she paused, breathless not from the climb, but from the sight before her. Below, in the wide valley, a new herd of Mustangs thundered across the open land. Among them, running with easy grace, was a mare with a copper coat and a distinctive crescent-shaped scar above her left eye. Crescent had not only survived, she had thrived, become a leader, and brought new life into the world. Abby watched, a tear tracking down her cheek, as Crescent's own foal, sleek and spirited, raced alongside her, leaping high into the air, wild and free. Abby sat in the tall grass, the wind playing with her hair, and let her memories drift. She remembered her brother and the loss that once weighed so heavy, her parents, and the way they taught her to respect the land. Every night spent by Crescent's side, fighting for life through the long blizzard. She saw the faces of the children who'd come through her gates, their awe at seeing wild horses for the first time, the hope in their eyes as they learned that kindness could change the world. She realized with a clarity as sharp as mountain air that her pain had become her purpose. Every act of care, every story shared, every wild horse she'd helped save had built something lasting, a chain of guardians stretching far beyond her own years. As the sun slipped lower, Abby spoke aloud, her words drifting out over the valley. "Sometimes, the greatest love is to let go and to trust the land to remember. That's the gift the wild gives us, the courage to defend, respect, and set it free." She sat there for a long time, watching Crescent and the new foal race the wind, Boone pressed warm and loyal against her side. The ranch lights twinkled in the distance, laughter and music floating up from the barn where volunteers finished chores. Abby's phone buzzed with messages from people across the country, requests for advice, updates from former volunteers, invitations to speak. The world was wide, but the connection she'd built here, in this place, was wider still. In the years that followed, Crescent's story grew, retold in documentaries and books, shared at conferences and school assemblies, painted on murals and whispered around campfires. Abby herself became something of a legend, though she always laughed and shrugged when people tried to pin heroism on her. "I just did what I could with what I had," she'd say, pouring coffee for a visitor or mucking a stall with a kid from the city. The land and the wild horses did the rest. One summer evening, as Abby welcomed a group of new volunteers, kids from the city, an old friend from high school, a young family searching for purpose, she told them the story one more time. She spoke of Crescent, the blizzard, the long nights of hope and fear, the choice to let go so that something wild and beautiful could survive. She ended the story as she always did, her voice ringing clear in the dusk. The true spirit of the West lives on, not in the taming of the wild, but in the courage to protect, respect, and set it free. Every act of compassion writes a new chapter in the story of the land. And remember, whatever you do here, however small it feels, you're part of something that will outlast us all. The fireflies came out as the sun vanished, and the wild mustangs ran beneath the stars, hooves striking sparks in the darkness. Abby sat quietly, the Mustang stone in her pocket, Boone's head resting on her knee. She felt a peace deeper than anything she'd ever known. Her story, Crescent's story, was not about endings, but about the power of beginning again. She had learned to turn loss into love, and love into legacy. As the night closed in, Abby Turner smiled, certain that the wild spirit she'd fought to protect would live on, running free forever across the Nevada land.